Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. The word geography is from the Greek word which literally means earth description. It is a science which studies the lands, the features, the inhabitants, and the phenomena of the earth. Many of you studied geography in school. Unfortunately, many of you have forgotten most of what you have studied. Our guest today is Dr. Susan Hume, an associate professor of geography at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. She promotes geography education to everyone, no matter what their background. Dr. Hume is a specialist in ethnic geography, the study of spatial and ecological aspects of ethnicity. As part of her training, she spent a year as an undergraduate exchange student at the University of Malawi. Malawi is a landlocked country in Southeast Africa. She regularly promotes the benefits of study abroad and has taken SIUE students on a 5-week travel study to South Africa. She's also participated in faculty travel studies to China, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. Dr. Susan Hume, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you.
Did I get all that right?
You did.
Oh, good, good. So now all right, so now from your perspective, why are you teaching geography?
Oh.
What got you started on that?
Oh, what got me started? Well, I began my freshman year of college actually as a biology major. And,
that's a long way from there to...
Well, yeah, and yet, that freshman year I was taking all my general education courses, and so I was taking a biology course, but I was also taking environmental studies and U.S. history and an anthropology course, and I loved all of them. I found all of them stimulating, and what I was beginning to realize was, if I pursued my career in biology, I was going to become increasingly specialized in that discipline, and yet I felt this pull of both the natural sciences and the social sciences. And so what drew me to geography, and for many geographers you'll hear a similar answer, is that it's an integrative science. In other words, it draws from the natural sciences and the social sciences and brings those together. And so what really interested me in the discipline was I didn't have to give up my love of history or sociology or psychology, and I could combine that with an interest in the natural sciences and in biology or geology or hydrology, for example.
Well, see, now you've just taken the audience from, oh, well, geography, isn't that maps? Isn't that like, and you've just said something entirely different than what they have most likely been told in the elementary or secondary education.
Sure, yeah.
Why is that happening? Why is it that when people are taught at that level about geography that they just think it's about maps?
Yeah, and certainly maps are an important tool that geographers use. I mean, they're a visual representation of something, of often numbers. And I must admit, I think geographers are very visual people. We love to take data that we've collected, numbers that we've collected, and we make a visual representation. We make a map out of it, or we make a graph out of it. And there are certainly advantages to doing that. It's much easier to take a list of numbers and turn it into a map. So for instance, election results in the last presidential election. You can map those. You can see red states and blue states, for example, and that's much easier to interpret visually than a list of numbers. What we experience, though, in school too often is that the people who are teaching social studies, because we don't tend to have standalone geography courses, some high schools do, but certainly elementary schools don't anymore. The people who teach social studies tend to have a very strong history background, but often they haven't had much geography. And they don't know, even if they've had the geography courses in college, they don't know how to integrate what they've learned in those courses into the social studies that they're teaching, the history that they're teaching.
What do you make of the reports that you see in the media that people, when asked, can you point on the map where Mexico is? Right. Can you point on the map where China is? show me where Africa is, and people are just standing there like blank.
Yeah, and certainly that's disheartening. You know, when you ask geographers generally about that, about, for instance, Americans, what we call place name knowledge, you know, find it on a map. We have mixed feelings about that because, for instance, when I'm sitting on an airplane and the person next to me asks me what I do for a living and I say I'm a geography professor, I get one of two answers. I either get, oh, rocks, and I say politely, no, that's geology. Right?
Right.
Or the other response is, oh, you must know all the state capitals, which I find amusing because it's like saying to an English professor, you must know how to spell a lot of words. You know, knowing place names, knowing where things are, that's a basic vocabulary for us, and it's definitely a useful tool. Do I know where every place is? Well, no, I don't need to, just like I don't necessarily need to know how to spell every word. There are atlases out there. I can look up that information. But it is important to have that basic knowledge. I mean, when we're sending, you know, over the last decade, we've sent troops off to Afghanistan and Iraq. Well, people need to know where those places are. They need to understand, for instance, the importance of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, for example.
The Falklands.
Right,
remember?
Sure,
well,
sure,
for some of our
younger
viewers, there was a war. There was a war in the Falklands in 1981. Was it 82? Somewhere in there, which is way down, just off the coast, off the east coast of South America.
Right.
Near Antarctica.
And that was the conflict between Britain and Argentina. And Argentina, here these islands are right off the coast, but because of the British colonial empire building, Britain had claimed those islands long ago. They thought they were strategically important and they were going to defend them no matter what. And that's a fascinating story. But when there are things that are so important that we're getting, you know, American interests involved in places around the world, we certainly need to know as citizens, as consumers, why those places are important, and we need to know where they are on the map.
Now, before we went on the air, we were having a little bit of an interesting discussion about rivers and how they flow. And I was telling you a story about standing at a park and watching it rain and how the water was going on the ground and eventually it would all come together. But I could imagine being up 5,000, 10,000 feet and looking down at rivers. And then you said something about rivers flowing south.
Right.
So let's just recreate that.
Yeah, well, and you know, what you're describing is, and I think this is great. I think this is a great way actually to teach kids about geography, to look at something like go to a park and watch little riverlets, little streams of water coming together. How are they flowing? We see that they're flowing downhill and they're converging.
Most maps are two-dimensional.
Right.
That's part of the problem,
right,
as opposed to relief maps, so you don't get that. And even if they are relief maps, they are so, the scale is just so small that you really don't get it.
And they're static, right? The water's not actually moving. And so if you take kids out into the real world and you show them things like that, then you can imagine, I mean, we would call that a watershed. It's a tiny micro-scale watershed. But then if you go into space and you use satellite imagery, you can see the same thing. The Mississippi River,
starting in Minnesota, all the way down to Louisiana,
and extending for the Mississippi River watershed from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains. So this notion, I mean, the Mississippi River drains 2/3 of the United States. So water that's rainwater that falls, for instance, on the west side of the Appalachian Mountains, that eventually flow into, you know, the Ohio River, or you have, you know, rainwater or snow melt on the east side of the Rocky Mountains that are flowing eventually into the Missouri River, that flows in the Mississippi River, that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. You can take that small scale in that park to understand that process and just bring it up to a larger scale, which raises a couple of important things. Geography is about process. I mean, sure, we can memorize where places are. That's kind of a basic vocabulary. But we want to understand how things work. I mean, geography enables us to understand the world around us. And so we're interested in the processes of how things work. And the other thing is we are very fascinated with scale, because if you ask a question at different scales, you can ask the same questions at a micro scale. How does that water flow in a park and come together? How does it do it across the United States? Sometimes, though, you get different answers when you ask a question at different scales. So, for example, every presidential election, we hear about red states and blue states. So we've come up, just in the last few years, that red is going to represent Republican, green, or blue is going to represent Democrat, and so we talk about red states and blue states. So we can have the results of the last presidential election on a state scale map, red states, blue states. But, and so you can ask the question, you know, where did the Democrats win states, where did the Republicans win states? But if you ask the same question and you show a county level map, county level voting results.
Entirely different, isn't it?
Very different picture, right?
Yes.
Now it's not about states that are in the Midwest or the South or on the coast. Now it's about the counties that are urban, the counties that are rural,
right,
for example, that's far more important. It tells us much more. It's a more complex map, but it gives us different answers to the question about voting patterns.
Exactly. Now, we got to go back a ways to something
Sure.
you said that caught my ear about how, oh yeah, in elementary school, they don't have a section on geography anymore.
No.
They just sort of fold it into social studies. As a geography professor, do you think that's a good idea?
Oh, it's so sad to me that that decision was made all the way back in the 1960s.
Who made this decision, and
Well,
why do they get away with this?
Sure. You know, if we go back to the 60s and we think about what was going on, of course, the Soviets launched Sputnik. There was this rise in the importance of science education and math education. And you know, in our grandparents' time, history and geography were taught side by side equally throughout a child's education. In the 60s, they made the decision to create this thing called social studies. It would be history, geography,
Is it the same time they created the new math?
I don't know about new math, but as a result then, we see geography subsumed really into becoming history with a little bit of these other things. So, you know, the history teacher pulls out a map and says, you know, now we're doing geography. Well, it isn't really geography. It's not how professional geographers think of what the discipline is. It's interesting because you asked about the polls that have been taken. So back in 1988, National Geographic Society commissioned a Gallup poll to survey geographic knowledge among Americans, but also among people in countries around the world. And just like all the other polls, we learned that Americans don't fare very well in basic questions about where things are around the world. But more important to me, when you look at the results of that first poll, is that the United States was the only country where young people in their 20s, did poorer on the survey than people who were in their 60s, for example. In European countries, young people perform better than older people. I mean, you would think that would be the case because they've been in school more recently. And yet, in the United States, that older generation had actually had geography in school as a standalone subject. And then, you know, you could also argue they're more aware of current events, for example. But I think that base of having had geography education as something separate, a standalone subject that has as much respect as history, is very important. It had a long-term impact, as the survey seems to indicate, throughout their lives.
I've been reading business reports from business leaders that are saying that the younger generation, when it comes in this current young generation, in other words, children who have just graduated from college, maybe up to age 30, come into a business environment, and the employers find that the students, or former students, now employees, see themselves as really hot and that they know everything. And the employer, from the employer's point of view, no, they don't. But yet the young people rate themselves, you know, in the 80–90% percentile, whereas the employers are down in the teens and 20s. Do you find that to be the case in your classroom, that students seem to think that they know more or are better at something than they actually are?
Maybe. It is interesting. We used to have a question on our course evaluation of asking a question about what grade a student would get as their final grade in the class. And I found those always to be overinflated. People would overestimate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, I have a great deal of respect for my students. I love teaching. I wouldn't have done it for so long if I didn't really enjoy it. Are students changing? Yeah, they are. I mean, in some senses, obviously, they're much more tech savvy than a previous generation of students. And we need to look for ways to harness that in the classrooms. And it's something that I struggle with and some of my colleagues do. So how do we change the way we teach to adapt to a new generation of students? Geography itself, it has become a much more technical discipline than it used to be. As an undergraduate student, I took a cartography course, a map making course, where I hand drew maps, hand colored maps, hand lettered maps. And there was a bit of artistry in that was really wonderful. I wasn't very good at it, but it was. When I decided to go back to school for my advanced degrees, I took cartography again a few years later. There was no hand drawing of maps. Everything was computer based. And I had the basic concepts of cartography, what maps are made up of, but I had to relearn how to make a map. Now, of course, we have geospatial sciences, geospatial technologies, things like GIS, geographic information systems, things like GPS. Now, global positioning systems, that used to be a tool that the military used. Civilians didn't even have access to it. Now we have it in our cars or on our phones. Satellite imagery. It's amazing to me in a 25-year period. I mean, we look at Google Earth, for example. Being able to have satellite imagery available to anybody who has access to the internet is amazing. Our ability to be able to zoom into a place and have that view from above, for a geographer, it's nirvana. It's all of a sudden we can explore all kinds of questions that used to be very off limits to only people in the military or people who had enough money to be able to purchase this satellite imagery. And now anybody, the 6-year-old can log on to the internet and go to Google Earth and actually fly through the Grand Canyon, for example. I mean, amazing.
I was just thinking that how much, when Alexander was marching east towards India with his armies, what he would have given just for a basic map. It's amazing when you think about it. And of course, young people don't think about these things, but older people do, that not that long ago, we didn't have a complete map of the world, did we? I mean, we're only talking, what, the 19th century?
Sure.
Parts of, I think, like Antarctica, maybe the 20th century?
Well, and even the 1880s, for example, there was a conference called the Berlin Conference that brought together European powers to carve up the continent of Africa. And when they sat down in late 1884, early 1885 at a big conference table, they spread out the maps they had of the continent. And then the whole purpose of this meeting was for them to divide up the wealth of the African continent without stepping on one another's toes, because they didn't want to have a war break out in Europe based on arguments over who was going to have access to what resources.
Of course, this was irrespective of the people who actually lived there.
Absolutely. The people who lived there had absolutely no representation at that conference. But when they laid out those maps, there were sections of the maps that were blank, that were unexplored.
1882, did you say?
1884, 1885 when they had this meeting.
So it just shows how it wasn't that long ago that the only way to learn something was to go there on a long trek.
Yeah.
And guys would actually map it out now.
And so what we see,
now
for instance,
any kid can know about an area.
Absolutely. So we see that evolution of what we call remote sensing. So remote sensing is any imagery from above. In as early as the Civil War, they were trying this from hot air balloons, you know, trying to get an overview of a battlefield. We see by the 1920s, 1930s, people getting in airplanes with cameras and flying a transect, a straight line, for instance, let's say over the Amazon rainforest, and taking pictures. And that was really valuable. We hadn't seen the Earth from above like that. And then you fast forward to the 1960s, and you have John Glenn orbiting the Earth. And then a little later in the 60s, you have somebody like Jim Lovell, who's you know, on his way to the moon, who can, for the very first time, look back at an entire Earth. And I've had the opportunity to see some of these former astronauts speak, and what strikes me as a geographer is how much respect they have for that. Their view of the Earth changed from being able to see the entire, well, half the Earth. They were able to see their side of the Earth.
Right.
Right, for the very first time. And that was only 50 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty incredible. Now, coming back to Africa, and now we're going to come to your specialty of ethnic geography. Mentioned that a lot of these folks who lived in Africa just had their traditional land split up by the Europeans during this period. Go ahead, talk about your ethnic geography and that particular aspect.
Yeah, I was drawn to ethnic geography because it brings together, you know, when we think about ethnicity, we're talking about people's language, their religion, their shared history, material culture, like their architecture, the clothing they wear, the foods they eat, things like that. So that's what we mean by ethnicity. And often, unfortunately, in mainstream, when we say ethnic, we're applying that to a minority group, but we all have an ethnic identity. Africa is a really interesting case where artificial country boundary lines were drawn dividing up nations of people. So when we think about the nation, you know, we often assume that a nation is a country. A nation is a group of people. And then we have
common bonds.
Exactly. And yet the state, or what we call in the United States the country, is the boundary lines. And what happened with the continent of Africa is the Europeans said, we'll divide up this African pie.
The Belgian Congo.
Yeah, Belgian Congo, you know. Tanganyika, which when they became independent, they combined with the island of Zanzibar, and they became Tanzania, exactly. And actually, Tanganyika is a really interesting case because it started out as a German colony. After World War I, when the Germans lost the war, it became a British colony. And there are other examples of colonies that were lost. Incidentally, at that 1884-1885 Berlin conference, the US had a representative there, not because we wanted colonies in Africa, but to represent the interests of Liberia. Liberia, a West African country, of course.
Jefferson started that.
Has you know, its capital is Monrovia. It's named after President James Monroe, and it was a Back to Africa movement. Former slaves who decided to return to the continent. They had no idea where their ancestors had been brought from, but they went to Liberia, which of course the name Liberia refers to liberty. So we actually the US sent a representative to the Berlin conference to say, hands off, European powers, don't touch it. And Liberia remained an independent country where everything around it was divided up. But you wind up with this strange phenomena in Africa then, where you had people of the same ethnicity, same family, who could be divided between, say, a British colony and a French colony. And so
just on the line.
Exactly. And so what does that mean over the long term? Well, it means, for instance, children today going to a French style school or a British system of education, speaking two completely different languages, and yet, you know, they're related to one another across an international boundary line. Ethnic geography can help us to understand so many issues that are going on in the world today. So, for example, we're seeing just recently a rise in secular violence in Iraq again. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, I don't think most of us, including members of Congress, had a sense of those people who made up the country of Iraq. I mean, it has three main ethnic groups. In the north are Sunni Kurds. Right. So they practice Sunni Islam, and they speak the Kurdish language, which, by the way, is what we call an Indo-European language. It's related to English and other European languages.
Kind of drifts over into Turkey.
Absolutely, and Iran.
And Syria,
absolutely.
Too. Yeah.
They're in several neighboring countries. They would love to have a Kurdistan, by the way. They'd love to have their own country, standalone country.
By the way, we've got about 3 minutes.
Okay. And then, you know, we have Sunni Arabs, and then we have Shia Arabs. So those are the three ethnic groups that make up the country. You would think, just like in, you know, a game of reality show Survivor, that you would have these groups sort of getting together to offset a different group. You'd think Sunni Arabs, well, they could get together with Sunni Kurds, or Sunni Arabs could get together with Shia Arabs. But Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Arab. He elevated that group. He oppressed the other two groups. And so when he was forced from power, the last thing the other two groups wanted was to have anything to do with those Sunni Arabs. Right. All of a sudden, Saddam Hussein's gone, and so now we have an elevated Iran, because he was the counterpoint to Iran. Iran is Persian, and they're Sunni, or Shia. Mm-hmm. Okay, so ethnically, in terms of language, they're different people, but they practice Shia Islam. So they joined up with the Shiites in Iraq, and so now we see the Shiite government, you know, dominated government in Iraq being supported by Iran, and now allowing arms, for instance, to be flown from Iran to Syria to support the Assad regime, President Assad in Syria, in their civil war, because Assad comes from a tiny minority, ethnic minority in Syria that is Shiite, in a Sunni-dominated country.
You know, when we were talking about dividing up Africa, I was thinking, well, yeah, but also then after World War I, when they divided up the Middle East, right. This is exactly the issue. That, I mean, they created Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Iran and Iraq.
Kuwait.
They wound up creating all of these issues, which we need to get back to at another time. Yeah. Unfortunately, you know, it's like the bell's about to ring for class. I just wanted to say thank you very, very much for coming and spending some time with us. Actually, this is far more interesting than I had even hoped for. So definitely want to come back, and perhaps we can discuss in more detail the kind of things that you have described.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. And to the audience, I've been speaking with Professor Susan Hume. She's a geography professor at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. Just want you to also know that this program is going to be loaded to YouTube. So if you're seeing it, you want other people to see it, just go to YouTube and look this up. Look it up under Conversation with Lee Presser and put Susan Hume's name in there or my name, and you should find it. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.